As we all know, Congress recently approved paying over $1 trillion to African Americans as reparations for slavery.
I'm rich, biatch!
Remember this Dave Chappelle skit? It was pretty much what white folks thought black people would do with the reparations check. But what are reparations anyway? And how do they work? Today's baggage, reparations. Reparations for slavery isn't all about getting that bag. It's part of it, for sure, but it's also about acknowledging and reconciling a wrong. In the United States, that wrong is what some would call this country's original sin, slavery. Something that we have never actually confronted. And in 2019, the chatter around reparations is louder than ever. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee sponsored a bill to study reparations proposals in January, and reparations have become a hot ticket issue for 2020 presidential candidates.
Reparations.
Should black people get reparations?
I think there has to be some form of reparations, and we can discuss what that is.
While there are debates about what reparations look like, one scholar suggests starting with acknowledging the atrocity, aka slavery.
The material consequences of a history of state-sanctioned and state-complicit violence, extraction, exploitation, and fraud, as well as policies committed against black people, manifest in terms of the racial wealth gap in an obvious way. The fact that blacks make up 12 to 14% of the population, but own probably something in the order of less than 4% of the country's wealth, or maybe 3%. I think that's indicative of a material consequence.
You want to know why that's crazy? I'll tell you why. Over $600 million, or just about half of the country's economic activity in 1836, came directly or indirectly from cotton. Cotton-producing enslaved people were just 6% of the population, and we're only talking about cotton here. Enslaved people helped build this nation's wealth, but once they were emancipated, the system made sure that the formerly enslaved couldn't build wealth.
But the consequences go well beyond material. The large disparities that exist across race isn't because blacks are a defective people, but rather there were events that have taken place both in the past and currently that have led to these gross inequalities.
Wait. Before we go too far in this conversation, let's talk about the beginnings of reparations for slavery. The idea has been around for around 150 years. I'm guessing that you've heard the phrase 40 acres and a mule? No, Spike Lee, not your production company. During the Civil War, hundreds of black refugees were massacred under the watch of a Union general. After word got out to the press, the Secretary of War pushed for damage control. He met with 20 black church leaders who suggested that the formerly enslaved should get land of their own. And get this, the government actually said yes. Field Order number 15 was drawn up to redistribute 40 acres to the formerly enslaved. What happened to the 40 acres proposed to black folks, you say? Lincoln was assassinated, and Andrew Johnson, a man who owned slaves, became president and threw the policy out the window. But throughout modern history, folks have made several attempts to keep the reparations conversation alive. In 1969, James Forman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee wrote the Black Manifesto demanding reparations from white religious institutions. Starting in 1989, Congressman John Conyers introduced a bill for reparations every single year until he left the House in 2017. And notably, in 2014, Ta-Nehisi Coates broke the internet with his 16,000-word piece, The Case for Reparations.
How do you define reparations?
Well, in the piece, we define it as America coming to grips with its own history.
Hamilton says reparations should consist of three components: acknowledgement, restitution or securing the bag, and reconciliation. Let's talk about number two, the guap, the cheddar, the dough, the shmoney, the coin. Presidential candidate Marianne Williamson, who is a spiritual advisor and good Judy's with Oprah, proposed a $100 billion plan to pay reparations. Other presidential hopefuls like Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, and Julian Castro have also been open to the idea of reparations. Others, like Cory Booker, haven't directly endorsed reparations, but support programs like baby bonds that would help the lowest income families regardless of race.
Should baby bonds be considered a sort of reparations? Absolutely not. They're different programs. I mean, we need to be addressing social equity with a race conscious, and that's how I would categorize baby bonds. So baby bonds deals with the gaping disparities around wealth, whether you're black or white. It is assuring that as a birthright, you get some capital so that when you become a young adult, you have a pathway towards asset security by using that capital to invest in an asset-enhancing endeavor like a home, like a debt-free education at a higher level, and like some seed capital to start a business.
What we definitely know is that giving black people back pay for their forced contributions will cost a pretty penny. Some policy experts say it could run the country trillions of dollars. But what's the holdup? It's not like victims of atrocities haven't gotten some compensation before. In 1974, the government reached a $10 million out-of-court settlement to compensate the victims of the Tuskegee experiment and their heirs. In 1988, the U.S. agreed to pay Japanese internees a total of $1.2 billion. In 1994, the state of Florida greenlit a reparations package totaling $2.1 million for the victims of the 1923 Rosewood Massacre. Outside of the U.S. remains quite possibly one of the most notable cases of reparations. As of 2012, Germany has paid out $89 billion to Holocaust survivors. So why aren't reparations for slavery being taken seriously in the U.S.?
Some people critique reparations by saying, oh, if you gave black people a check, they'll just go out and blow it and spend it on, some people literally say Cadillacs in a stereotypical way. Now, there's some humor in that, but frankly, if black people want to buy Cadillacs, they should be entitled to buy Cadillacs.
Stereotypes aside, there's victim blaming along with sayings like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. The problem is that these notions completely ignore the factors that have directly caused inequality.
We are at a moment where we're really grappling with our history, again, with integrity, to understand that people aren't poor because they simply make behavioral choices.
In addition to a check, Hamilton says serious reparations proposals should also include land or some other form of long-lasting capital. Whether reparations take the form of individual payments to victims or social programs targeted towards afflicted groups or property, either way, it's about equity. Slavery and its legacy has no doubt set black people back. Hamilton says that race equity in a broad sense will be achieved when black folks proportionately have the same economic and political power as white people. What will it take to get reparations?
At the end of the day, in order to get reparations implemented, there's going to need to be a social movement. And I believe that it will happen, and I believe that it can happen in my lifetime. But I certainly also know that the issues aren't whether a particular politician supports or doesn't support it. At the end of the day, we're going to need a movement to get to that point.
In case you missed it, free black labor built this country. And centuries of slavery and its aftermath caused a tremendous wealth gap and disparities in education, incarceration, housing, and health that still exists today. Reparations would be the formal apology that African Americans deserve. It's a big old I'm sorry with money to back it up. But let's be real. No amount of money can pay out the centuries of trauma endured by a people. They're a collective I see you to how a group of people were screwed over by institutionalized racism. It's also an I see you moment to how much enslaved people contributed to the wealth of this country. Reparations aren't a handout, they aren't a leg up. They are deserved. Now let's see who's not just about black votes, but for black people.